the Russian war on Ukraine grinds on in its 19th month, there are no signs of an end on the horizon. On the one hand, a joint declaration of the recently concluded G20 summit in New Delhi avoided naming Russia even while acknowledging the suffering of the Ukrainian people. On the other, North Korea's President Kim Jong-un visited Russia to meet his Russian vis-à-vis Vladimir Putin and described Moscow's invasion as, in quote, a sacred fight, unquote. Between those two visions, Ukraine's nearly 37 million people continue to suffer from the often randomly dropped bombs and mounting destruction. Notwithstanding, Ukrainians remain resolute in not giving in or giving up. Ina Sovsun, a prominent member of Ukraine's parliament, summed up that resoluteness by saying a victory from their standpoint is won when there is not a single Russian soldier on their soil. To understand the state of the war and how Ukrainians are coping with its devastating impact, Mayanchaya report spoke to Ina Sovsun, who is also a former First Deputy Minister of Education and Science from 2014 to 2016. Ina Sovsun.
How do you see the G20 Delhi Declaration, on the one hand, not explicitly naming Russia, but acknowledging the suffering of the Ukrainian people, and on the other, the North Korean strongman, Kim Jong-un in Moscow, apparently selling ammunition? How do you see this dichotomy?
Well, on the side of the Delhi Declaration, as you can imagine, we would wish to see different wording. We wish for Russia to be explicitly named the aggressor state. The fact that it is not named as an aggressor state is, of course, disappointing for us. There are lots of discussions among different politicians here in Ukraine. Some are saying that it's better not to have any declaration at all than to have a declaration which all big countries agree to, where Russia is explicitly not named the aggressor state. We kind of pretend that Ukraine is the victim, but the victim of what? Of which entity? It's not specified. So it's a difficult diplomacy, I would say, and we understand that Russia has a levy of influence in different countries, particularly outside of the of the West, of the general West. But I want for the other countries, particularly those that are called Global South, though I don't really like the wording, to understand something that because many of them are kind of closely related to Russia, and they often see this, particularly in India, what I know from giving multiple interviews to the Indian TV channels. They often say that, yeah, we don't like to support Ukraine so much because US is supporting Ukraine. US is an empire, so we want to be, on the side of the anti-empire movement. And I do think that is a very strange statement when I first heard it, because this is a completely reverse situation. For us, for Ukraine, Russia is the empire. We were the colony of Russia, and what we are fighting is against the empire, which is Russia. So I wish for the countries which have been colonies in one form or other to understand that anti-colonial war that we are in right now is something that was part of their past as well. But for some reason, there are very weird conversations around it, and I don't think that this anti-colonial element of our battle is understood well enough in India and in many other countries outside of the West. So I do think that this debate is very much missing, and I do think that there should be more intense communication of that, because I understand for India, Ukraine is a very abstract country somewhere in Eastern Europe. But for us, Russia has always been the empire. Russia was the one that was forbidding Ukrainian language to be used in schools. Russia was the country that forced, burning the books which were printed in Ukrainian, and all of that. That for us, they are the empire, and the fight we're in is anti-imperial fight right now. So I wish that other countries understood this a little bit better, but probably we also have to do our part of the job in explaining this anti-colonial element of our war. Then regarding another event taking place, basically right now, is the North Korean leader visiting Moscow. Well, let's be honest about that. There were very low expectations on the side, regarding North Korea. It's clearly a dictatorship state. It's the most closed country in the world. So there were very little expectations about which side they will take. But I do think that with this visit, it's important for other countries that are now, trying to keep the neutral ground, at least in this war. To realize, do they really want to side with the country who is partnering up with North Korea? Why EU member state Hungary, they are EU member state, they're in NATO, and they side, or at least they are friendly with Russia, who is partnering up with the most totalitarian regime in the world. Recent statements by Brazilian president saying that Russian president is welcome to come to Brazil. He will not be arrested there. Why do they side with a country that is for which it is okay to deal with a dictatorship regime in North Korea? So again, very low expectations regarding North Korea itself. But I do wish to see reaction from those countries that are trying to claim that they are the peace group, that they just want peace. Well, that peace you're promoting is peace with North Korea including. So I do think that this is important. Not North Korea. I mean, we cannot change their minds, probably not us, at least. That's for other countries to deal with. But for the countries that claim to be democratic, I think they should take sides and take better sides on that story.
But don't you think somewhere along there has been a fairly staggering failure on the part of Ukrainian leadership to explain exactly what you're saying? Because reflexively, all these countries tend to see Ukraine as sort of an adjunct of the US empire, as it were. And somehow, of course, you're in the middle of a nasty war, so one cannot expect now, but in the past, perhaps attempts should have been to explain the situation that you would have been, just as Russia was beginning to mount an aggression.
The very idea that we are part of the American empire is so weird to us, because we never had any historic connections to, so kind of, it's like explaining why you are not wearing pink. It's like if you never wore pink, it's just a very strange idea. It's like explaining why we are not part of the American empire. Well, there is no grounds to think that we ever have been, right? I mean, it's not even Latin America where United States had a complicated history and so on and so forth. Truly, for Ukraine, the EU is a much closer partner, including historically. Historically, parts of Ukrainian territory have been under Polish control, under Hungarian control. So we are in that, like, we have never been very closely allied with America, so to speak, and then we didn't have a strong historical connection with the US. I mean, no bigger than any other country, I would say, in our part of the world. So I think on the one hand, it was just a strange thought that never occurred to us that this needs explaining. On the other hand, I do understand that communication needs to be more direct and explaining things more directly in understanding the context. Understanding the context that we are trying to influence. For instance, when we started talking when me and other MPs started giving interviews to the Indian TV channels, that was a very unpleasant experience, I will tell you. Because they were all like, it was like first couple of weeks of war when we were all hiding in shelters, and Russian army was like 20 minutes drive from my home. And then suddenly someone is saying like, yeah, you are the puppet state for the United States. And we're like, there is Russian army and there is not a single American soldier here. Like, so, it was very, very emotionally offending, truly, this very statement. Yeah, but I do think that by now we understand that, we have, I think also part of the problem is that Ukraine never had this global ambitions. We deal with the EU, which is our biggest trading partner. We do have, contacts with some other regions, some other countries, but it's like we never had to explain ourselves to Latin America a lot, for instance, just because we don't have lots of contact. So we were trying to work with the EU, for instance, mostly, and then partially America, which were our biggest partners. But now, given that we need global support, I think that there is a growing understanding that we have to deal with with other countries who don't know much about us. So I think we're working on that. I also wish we started earlier, that we realized the problem a bit earlier. But well, we also learn.
I mean, somewhere along the line, once again, it should have been realized that you would get co-opted into the NATO politics vis-a-vis Russia. There is an element of that at work here too. So don't you think that should have been recognized earlier?
I think it's vice versa. The feeling of the people who were initially promoting NATO membership was that Russia is a threat. It has always been a threat for us for 300 years. And the only way for us to save ourselves from this threat is NATO membership. So it was not like we started NATO membership for some unknown reason. There was a very specific reason why the debate on NATO membership started. And that was because we recognized that Russia has been, a colonizing power for us for 300 years. And I know that, I mean, it's ongoing discussion since, like mid-2000s, but it has always been in keeping in mind that this is the bloc which can ensure our security, and our only kind of source of insecurity comes from Russia. So when we were doing that, it's not like we were trying to provoke Russia. It's because we know that Russia was a threat. That is why we needed to get into NATO.
If Kim indeed supplies ammunition to Putin, don't you think it will merely reinforce the growing perception that Ukraine has now become sort of a staging ground for a new great game between Russia on the one side and the US on the other, in a manner of speaking? Because that's like what happened in Afghanistan, for instance. It has been an eternal hub of the great game between these powers. Now it seems it's shifting to Ukraine in some ways.
First of all, I think Kim supplying weapons to Russia, we take it cautiously, very cautiously, because it's a guessing game. But still, we cautiously take it as a good sign. I'll explain.
Yeah.
The fact that Russia needs to ask a small country of North Korea to provide ammunition mean that they're really running out of their supplies. So again, we can't be 100% sure. It could be just a political gesture of and so on and so forth. But I do think that this is a good sign. If they're running out of ammunition, that's a good sign for us. Regarding your statement that this will be the territory of war between US and Russia. Again, there is not a single American soldier who was sent here by the American army, by the administration to fight here. It's still Ukraine.
Sorry to interrupt, but I'm saying in terms of it is sort of a proxy being waged. It is being seen by many here as a sort of a staging ground to keep needling the Russians. And you get co-opted into it for no fault of yours, surely on the basis of your geography.
Well, we get co-opted in this because Russia attacked us. That's that's the single reason why we're in it. We don't want to defend American interests. We don't want to defend EU interests or whatever, but we really want to defend our own country. So there is no, I think Ukraine is still the one making the decisions about military strategy, even though there are consultations, as we know, between Ukrainian generals, NATO generals, American generals, EU generals, and so on and so forth. But after all, at the end of the day, it's our chief generals who are making the final decisions. American weapon, British weapon, Polish weapon is, of course, being used. But yeah, I would say that it's wrong to assume that makes us a proxy, because that kind of neglects the sacrifices of our army and our people, and that also makes it seem like there are two equal sides to the story, Russia and America. Well, they're not equal in this particular situation. There is one country who is an aggressor and another country who is helping the victim. That has to be very, very clear.
I want to change gears a bit. I'm always interested in the sheer human cost of what has happened. Say I'm a child sitting in Kiev, 5-year-old, 8-year-old. suddenly a bomb drops randomly and I die. For absolutely no fault of mine, I've been wiped out for somebody's hubris. People are not focusing on that cost at all. In that context, I'm interested to know how is it for your son and millions of other children going back to school in the 19th month of this Russian invasion?
Yeah, I share your concern that this human suffering and human cost is not getting enough attention. In terms of children, I will have to point out that there are, I would say, three different types of situation. One, which I believe is, well, probably the best, at least that's the situation that I chose for my own son. He stays in Kiev with his parents. He can go to school because his school has a bomb shelter. Not all schools in Ukraine have it. As of right now, the numbers are growing. As I think they recently reported that about 70% of schools have bomb shelters. So in case the school has the bomb shelter, kids can go there and study offline. They also could, my son did it last school year as well, so he went to school throughout the whole year. But the problem is when there is an air raid alert in the city, which it depends on how often it happens. I think the last one we had 2 days ago, Monday we had last air raid alert. Truly, majority of people in the city, they will not go to the bomb shelter right now. Because it's just particularly happens too often, and most likely, like there is an air raid alert over the whole country. Kiev has a relatively good air defense, and so on and so forth. The majority of people don't go. I would give two exceptions to that. One is children in the schools, and I share this concern. We don't want Russians to target schools, so children always go to the bomb shelter. And second, if you are in some sort of administrative building, like in the parliament, because parliament can be, a high probability it will be a target, we also go to the bomb shelter. So my biggest concern as a mother is that when there is an air raid alert, that my son Martin doesn't have mathematics class, because I really don't want him to miss math, because it's very difficult to follow. But I would believe that this is kind of the best case scenario for the child right now. Then there are children in cities, villages closer to the front line, like in my native Kharkiv.
Right.
They didn't open schools there. So kids either continue to study online, and let me remind you, it's the fourth school year. It started with COVID, the fourth school year that kids study online, which is going to have immense effect on the quality of the education they're getting. And what they did, and I was born and raised in Kharkiv. I went to school for 10 years in Kharkiv. So when I read this, I seriously cried when I read about this. First, they had the first day of school celebration in the metro stations, which really made me cry. And they also opened, I think, 50 classes in underground stations for kids in primary schools. So, I mean, it's good that they're trying to come up with the solutions, but the very idea that you have to bring your child to the metro station to study is truly heartbreaking. But I would say that there are even worse situations than that, because there are kids on the occupied territories. And kids on the occupied territories in Zaporizhia, in Kherson region on the south, they're newly occupied territories, they're in the worst situation than anybody else, because they are, by the occupational authority, they're being forced to go to the Russian schools with Russian curriculum, with Russian teachers. They're being forced to sing Russian anthem, to look at portrait of Vladimir Putin that they put in all the schools, which is, kids of 7 or 9 might not understand the situation. But if there are teenagers of 14 years old who have always been Ukrainian, they have always seen the Ukrainian flag and sung the national anthem, and now they're being forced to sing Russian anthem and to claim that Putin, who occupied their own city, is their president. But the problem is, the biggest problem is that in case parents refuse to send their kids to the schools which are run by Russian military, they are threatening to take their kids away from the parents. And unfortunately, there have been situations like this. There have been even worse situations. There was a torture chamber for children found after liberation of parts of Kherson region, with a boy of 14 who reported how he was tortured because they believed that he was working for Ukrainian army, a 14-year-old teenager. So torture is extreme situation, but the situation where kids are being forced to study in, according to Russian curriculum, and where parents have to make very tough choices whether to try to send kids to the government-controlled territories or children being taken away from them. That is just heartbreaking. And then, of course, that there is thousands of Ukrainian children who have been kidnapped basically by Russia. And that's why Putin, the arrest warrant was issued by the ICC. So I would say that there are different situations for different children. And then, of course, there are children outside of Ukraine. So there are children who are now living mainly in EU countries. So they're relatively safe, but they cannot see their dads because men are not allowed to leave. It's particularly difficult for kids whose mainly dads are in the army. I have friends who are in the army. They haven't seen their kids for over a year. So they're growing up without mainly their dads, sometimes even without their mothers, if their mothers is like, for instance, a doctor, and they're living with their grandparents.
But that gives me an interesting segue into, is there anyone who is looking at the traumas being caused by this war, especially among children, because you are almost entering your second year. You'll complete second year soon in February. Is there any attempt to look at that subject at all, or are you too distracted by the sheer survival challenges?
Well, first of all, we are going into the 10th year of war, and that's also important,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
But in terms of this whole-scale invasion, a big war, as we call it, I think, people are talking about mental health right now. Our First Lady has taken on this topic. She's trying to do some work in that direction. And though I have typically been rather skeptical about, any policy solutions in that directions, but I can feel the pressure growing inside of me. I can feel how mentally exhausted I am. First of all, just by sheer fact of me living in this situation, but also because my partner is on the front line all the time. And I will, if you ask, before we started the official part of the debate, you asked me how I am. I would say that the answer to that question is I'm very, very exhausted. And that's mainly mental exhaustion. And when you are so exhausted to this level, you just it's very difficult, and that's something which even I can recognize that some help is needed. And I'm not even talking about kids who have been living in Kharkiv under bomb shells. I'm not talking about families who lost their loved ones, because for them, of course, it's another level of sufferings. I'm not comparing my exhaustion with their level of sufferings.
Yeah. Just last couple of things. How do you see the EU's dependence on the Russian gas in the context of Putin being able to prolong this war?
I'm very. There were recently news that supply of LNG from Russia to EU grew 40%, and you know that there are no sanctions against Russian gas in the EU. Basically, last year Putin just refused to sell it to Europe, trying to create the crisis. Luckily, he failed. But they're still selling LNG, and by buying Russian LNG, they're funding this war of Russia against Ukraine. I think it was yesterday Putin made a statement, which of course we cannot verify because we cannot trust any data from Russia, but I think there is something to it. He said that the assets, the Russian assets that have been frozen on the West, they have already doubled their income during this war compared to the assets that have been frozen. And again, even if they haven't doubled it, even if it's the same that has been frozen, this speaks to the inefficiency of sanctions. And that is unfortunately mainly in the energy sector. That is where there need to be tougher sanctions, both on gas, but also in nuclear. I'm extremely disappointed that there is no big sanctions against Russia and Rosatom, a Russian nuclear company, which has basically committed the biggest act of nuclear terrorism in history. They have captured a nuclear power plant, and they're threatening to do something about it. And then, they're making the situation insecure, not just for Ukraine, because you understand, radiation doesn't know the borders. But there is no big sanctions. And there have been some sanctions introduced by the Brits against some top officials, but no big sanctions against Russian nuclear energy. Russian Rosatom is building new nuclear power plant in Hungary, in the EU, in the NATO member state. I'm not even talking about them building new nuclear stations in other countries outside of the Western Bloc, so to speak. But still, the US is still dependent on Russian nuclear fuel, about 20%. France, about 30%. That is unacceptable. That is the big, we can make this war smaller if the West stops funding Russian economy.
Yeah. What is the end game now? When it started, people thought basically the Russians will wrap it up in a matter of weeks, given that Ukraine was weak. Now you are almost 2 years. Where do you think you are headed? Is it just going to go on like this?
Well, it will go on until Ukraine wins, because we are in a situation where we don't have a choice. We have, when the war started in 2014, then it basically turned into frozen conflict by 2016, and see where it led us to, into a big war 6 years after that. So any situation of freezing the conflict, for us, it will mean that Russia will attack again in 5, 6, 8 years. And that is something that we want to avoid. We have suffered too much, and we need to finish this war now. We cannot freeze it any longer. Because if we freeze it and they start the war in 8 years again, my son will be old enough to be drafted into the army. We don't want our children to inherit this war. That's very strong personal feeling for all of us. I know for many people who are on the front line, for me as a politician, for me as a mother. Yeah, we need to make sure that our kids, they're still living through this war right now, but we want them to have a future. Living in a country which has a frozen conflict is very difficult. I'll tell you this from my experience working in the government as first Deputy Minister of Education and Science in 2014, 2016. It's not just that part of your territory is not under your control. It's a constant source of trouble. You have, in my, one would think like, yeah, what does Ministry of Education has to do with this? Well, lots of it. Half of our work was directed in dealing with the children from the occupied territories, recognizing their education, helping them to get from the occupied territories to the controlled territories for university studies, and so on and so forth. It always and that is just minor tasks. I'm not even talking about security measures and all of that. So living in a country with a frozen conflict will prevent us from developing the country. Will make us a poor country which spends half of its resources on this conflict. That's what we don't want. So we need this conflict to have the final end to it.
Yeah. What does victory look like to you? What is victory at this stage?
On a very personal note?
No, as a country.
I will say on a personal note that's my partner coming back home. That's
absolutely. And all partners coming back home.
Yeah. But I would say that as a country, there are basically two major elements to it. One is not a single Russian soldier on Ukrainian soil, as recognized by international agreements. Second is people who committed war crimes, Russian generals, Russian officials, they get the punishment. That's critically important. And then there is a third element to it, which is not the victory itself, but what we do with the country after the victory. And that is, we have to use this chance of building a better country. That's not part of the victory debate, because victory has those two definitions. Is no Russian soldiers on our soil, and punishment for those who committed to those crimes against Ukrainians.
When you say internationally recognized, are we talking the 1991 borders? What are we talking about? Because there's so
There are
many.
there are no other borders. There are no other borders
So
than the one that.
that's your take on it. Because again, there are several questions about the actual demography of Ukraine. I was reading up the other day, and people say all kinds of things about what exactly is Ukrainian demography. What is your idea of Ukrainian demography? 1991.
In 1991, over 90% of Ukrainians in every single region voted to support independence. In Crimea, in Donbass, regarding the language, regardless of the language that they spoke, regardless their ethnicity, over 90% of Ukrainians in Crimea voted for independence. And I think that is important for and it was fair and free referendum, not like the ones that Russians conducted under the threat of weapons. So demography doesn't matter. There are people who speak French and there are people who speak English in Canada, but they're all Canadians. And it doesn't mean that France can occupy part of Canada by claiming that there are people who speak French there. Spain cannot occupy part of the territories of the United States, saying that there are people who speak Spanish there. Yeah. So that is what people need to understand: is people. There are Russian-speaking soldiers who are fighting against Russia right now. Right. Because they can speak whichever language, but they identify themselves as Ukrainian. That is what people need to know about Ukrainian demography.
And finally, before I let you go, Elon Musk has said that there was an emergency request from government authorities in September last year to activate Starlink to Sevastopol. The obvious, and I'm quoting him, the obvious intent being to sink most of the Russian fleet at anchor. And he says if he had agreed to that request, SpaceX would have been explicitly complicit in a major act of war. How do you look at his role in this whole debate?
Well, first of all, I don't know of a single situation where a company that provides any type of supplies to the army was made responsible for the war itself. It's still the responsibility of the people who operate it, right? It would have still been the responsibility of Ukraine, and Ukraine would bear the consequences. And I wish for Elon Musk to, how do I put it mildly, not to engage in discussions where he lacks expertise. Okay. And even though I understand he has the deciding power, because we use his equipment and it's good, and we are grateful for him for supplying it in the first days of war. But he really should be very careful in shaping the decisions of the military. Particularly if we're talking about the country that again has been victim of foreign aggression. If he kept quiet about it, no one would have known about this, and he would never have been part of the debate. And we would have been eternally grateful for him just for supplying the Starlinks. They really did their job. We are very grateful for that. Right. Yeah, we just wish he didn't intervene in the military decision making of Ukrainian. And
given his personality, I mean, this is to be expected, right?
Yes. There can be a longer debate held about that, but we should stop here.
Sure. And just last bit, have you been following some of the pronouncements made by a presidential candidate, Vivek Ramaswamy?
Yes.
He takes a position which is very akin to someone he desperately admires, Trump, on this. What do you think a debate like this does to your country?
Well, I think this confuses American voters, and I think that is irresponsible on the side of politicians of a democratic state to side with a totalitarian regime, or basically not to side, but to try to appease a totalitarian regime. The West has become what it is because it was always following, after all, in a bigger scheme of things. I'm not saying there were no problems in the American foreign policy. Gosh, there were. We all understand it. We recognize it. but it doesn't mean that siding with the wrong side of history is right. And him basically saying that, yeah, if I remember the quote correctly, that the supply of weapons to Ukraine should be stopped, and that giving part of Ukraine to another country, to Russia, is something that he would support. Well, he is living in a democratic state, and he should really appreciate it. And he really should appreciate people fighting for having the same democratic rule much more. I think it's unfortunate that he's really not feeling this, and not appreciating democracy that he basically, used for his advantage as well, that he's fighting in as well.